Joanne Wilson, and this is Positively Gotham Gal. Real, honest, and meaningful conversations with women entrepreneurs about their approach to life, business, and everything in between.
I'm going to start with a quote from you. The best way to overcome the taboo and reintegrate psychedelics into the fabric of society is by undertaking the very best scientific research.
Yes, I said that thought and said that in about 1970, when the restrictions had come down, because I realized the kind of full, incredible kind of potential benefits of psychedelics back in 1966, when I first kind of started to understand how they could be used to expand cognition and also attain the mystical experience. And I was kind of just amazed by their capacity to be invaluable tools for humanity.
I agree with you 100%. I'm not exactly sure why everyone in every government sees it differently. So what was your first interaction with psychedelia that it transformed the way you thought about it, that it became something you cared about passionately?
Yes, it transformed the way I thought and experienced to an altogether kind of deeper and higher state, in my opinion. I had grown up as a child in a very isolated situation, and like many children, I think, I had mystical experiences. So I knew that altered state of consciousness and was very intrigued and fond of it. And so I then studied mysticism and comparative religions at Oxford under Professor Zehner, who was then the leading person in the world on the subject, and got my kind of feet in the water there. And then when I was given LSD in 1966.
How old were you then?
1965, when I first given it, I was 22.
Perfect age.
Yeah, I was a kid, and I was absolutely, but I knew quite a lot because it had been my pet passion about mysticism.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, this is amazing, something which can lift you to the kind of territory of the mystical experience. And but I also said in those early years, or earlier, in a funny sort of way, it was a trip to the fun fair, a mystical fun fair, but I couldn't quite see how one could live on it. And then I had the very good fortune of meeting a Dutch scientist, doctor, and who had a new hypothesis about the underlying mechanism which brought about the change, which was, put very simply, an increase of capillary volume in the brain at the expense of cerebral spinal fluid, because in an enclosed space you can't increase one fluid without having less of another. So we saw it as the veins constrict to fill the capillaries, pressure builds up, and cerebral spinal fluid, which is the other fluid in the brain, is pushed out and replaced by blood for as long as it takes for gravity to put it back to its ordinary position, because blood is heavier than cerebral spinal fluid. And so that opened up a whole new potential understanding of how one could use psychedelics for enhancing cognitive functioning, for instance, and actually changing the setting. I realized that at a very early age. In that first year I took it, I decided I'd had a very bad habit, which I got when I was a young child, of smoking nicotine, because I was very tall and I wanted to stop growing, and I heard that smoking stopped growing. So by 22, I was quite a full-time smoker and loved it. And anyway, Bart, who was this Dutch scientist, thought it was a horrible habit. So I decided I'll give it up. I'll take one big dose of LSD and decide to give it up. And I did that, and I never smoked again. So years later, maybe whatever it was, 30 years later, I suggested this study to Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins. And that was the basis of, we collaborated on an early study of the study Overcoming Nicotine Addiction, which has had such an enormous success, kind of 80% success in the first study. And so I was at that point. So in 1966, I met this Dutch scientist, and that really very much changed my life, because suddenly I could see how one could base this new understanding on kind of a firm scientific basis. And so that became my aim, which it hadn't been before. I'd grown up in an artistic background.
Your family was artists?
But through Bart, I got a passion for science and how we can discover how these things work in the brain so that we can persuade or indicate to society their potential enormous value.
Yes.
So that became my kind of life's mission.
And when that became your life's mission, as you started getting involved with scientists, you also started getting involved with promoting this. When was it, you were also one of the first people that performed trepanation on yourself. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that is?
Yes, funny enough, it's related to the explanation of how psychedelics work.
Mm-hmm.
Because what we're proposing is that that basically the question is, what are altered states of consciousness? I mean, actually, we know so little about consciousness, let alone altered states. One's talking in a kind of complete fog of ignorance. And that's why science hated the word consciousness. And Crick, the great scientist, said, never mention the word consciousness in a funding application because you won't get funding. It was a dirty word, basically. Keep away from consciousness. And that's, let alone expanded altered states of consciousness, which are completely taboo. So it was a new area to be discovering. And I mean, obviously, the ancient mystics, the Buddhas, and the people from history have all known about the power of altered states of consciousness. And indeed, I think human society has been based on it. I think that's what kind of cracked through the talking ape to become what we've become, the dominator of our planet, was this through the power to enhance our cognitive functioning, as is shown in the incredible artwork at Chauvet. I don't know if you know those French caves, which are about 35,000 years old,
Mm-hmm.
and they're the first expression of art. And in my opinion, they're more beautiful than anything that's been produced since. I mean, they've never been surpassed, I don't think. And they were quite obviously on an altered state of consciousness. So very early humanity was making use of this knowledge.
I mean, even if you go into churches and you look at a lot of the frescoes and what have you, not from the Catholic Church, there's mushrooms and there's,
Yes.
it was all psychedelics. And even if you go back into our history from coming over here from England, everyone was drinking and doing every drug possible. And so when do you think this all took a turn for this anti-mind exploration?
No, absolutely. I think it's always been a fairly esoteric occupation. There's been a sort of mystery around altered states. And but that became really a taboo. I think, sadly, the Christians were rather to blame for it getting worse. You know, they sacked Alexandra and all the great art and burnt the books and everything in, when was that? 400 BC, as far as I remember. But well, no, when was it? That was 400 AD, I suppose. But I think Christianity hasn't been kind. They pay respect to their saints who had mystical experiences, but they're rather oddballs outside society, you know, but they're still respected. But
Yes,
I think it was
control.
much more, it was kind of like as Western civilization, i.e. Greek, Roman, they were all on the psychedelic. At the very center of the classical culture was the psychedelic experience at, as I'm sure you know, at Eleusis, where every Socrates, Plato, all the great thinkers of the classical age all experienced a dying and being reborn again. But it was very strictly secret. And if people talked about it or did it in the wrong setting, it was a death sentence. And possibly that's why Socrates had to kill himself, because he played with LSD at the dinner parties with his charmful friends. And that was taboo. But the funny thing is that is taboo, because both my sons studied classics at Oxford. And it was absolutely not mentioned. It was a taboo subject. You couldn't do your thesis on the fact that Rome had whatever, 450 places where you could buy drugs or something. You know, it was very much.
Yes, we've completely changed the society. And what's must be interesting for you is someone who has been involved in this from the very onstart of this century and last century, is that we're seeing it return to society is something that can be helpful, just like you stop smoking cigarettes.
Absolutely. And that, I have to say, it was a very exciting period. I grew up, in a sense, outside society. I live in a rather odd place, which is on the edge of a fen, surrounded by 3 moats. And we had no money. It was a very beautiful place and wonderful, lovely family, but no money. So we didn't have petrol and we were very isolated. And so I grew up rather. My father was I suppose, a bit of an anarchist, and would say, well, whatever the government tells you, always do the opposite, because he thinks it's like second-rate people often, and you don't really want to follow that, go by what you think yourself. So I didn't really mind being outside society, if you see what I mean, because I was totally convinced that of the value of these compounds. I could see this is an amazing breakthrough for humanity, and it's what humanity's always had at its core. But now we have the potential to give it its scientific explanations and really bring it into society, so it gets integrated and therefore used in a sensible and clever way. That was my hope from 1966 onwards.
Well, it looks like it might be starting to happen in 2022. So, what was it like even back then being a female scientist in a predominantly male world?
Yes, yes, it was very much a male world, and I felt very lucky, because I felt I'd fallen on my feet by meeting this Bartugas, who had a very, very brilliant scientific hypothesis. Not that I'm saying every detail is right, but I'm personally pretty sure that slowly I'll manage to demonstrate that the underlying features of it are right, which is, it was discovered very cleverly that the psychedelics work through the serotonin 2A receptor. But funnily enough, that became, in a sense, the end of the story, as if it was the answering to the story. But actually what's interesting is, what does the serotonin 2 receptor bring about in its effect?
Mm-hmm.
And I would suggest one of the major differences which comes about is an increase in capillary volume in the brain, which means suddenly there are billions of extra neurons functioning simultaneously. So the question was, how do you research that, and how do you kind of try to teach the world that these are amazing compounds which should be respected, not criminalized? And after I had been trying to do it for 30 years about, I realized, well, as an individual female with no letters after my name, because I left school at 16, and no money, and no reason why anyone should listen to me. How does one open the doors of the scientific world to do the research one needed?
And how did you?
At that point in the 90s, brain imaging had just been discovered. And I grew up as an artist, so brain imaging was a wonderful idea that you could actually see in the brain, so you could relate a scientific happening with a subjective experience, and maybe show what is happening in the brain to explain it better, and therefore enable us to use it better.
Is that when you began the Beckley Foundation?
Yes. That was, I began in I think it was 1996. But then I called it the Foundation to Further Consciousness. And then I decided that's too kind of whatever, hippie. It needs a more serious name. And I called it after the name of my house, the Beckley Foundation, because I thought it sounded like Berkeley and Bletchington and all the bees. And funny enough, my good luck was that I got a leading, almost, I think, the leading neuroscientist, someone called Sir Colin Blakemore, who wanted to back me in what I was doing. And so he became on my advisory board. And then I also had Albert Hoffman and Sasha Shulgin and most of the leading neuroscientists. So that kind of gave me an establishment. And so it was much easier to do things as Beckley Foundation, a kind of abstract concept, than as Amanda Feilding.
Right.
So it was a great advice. It was a good move. It was like a Trojan horse.
Right. Well, it was a group of people.
I like to do it with the top players, kind of thing, to influence, if possible, from the top. So right at the beginning, I started giving seminars at the House of Lords, and I'd ask the Prime Minister and the Home, all the kind of top people, head of NIDA, wonderful man, who said what a wonderful time he'd had on his LSD trip. It was the most, which shocked all the Americans.
So at the Beckley Foundation, it was twofold. You were working on this science program, and you were also integrating that into policy.
Yes. Because I realized you couldn't do the science without altering the politics, because actually it was impossible to do research with, say, LSD. It had got such a enshrouded in taboo that no one was prepared to touch it unless they were getting negative outputs. So no one wanted to do a positive finding, because then they'd lose their grants and be thrown out of the university. So one had to change the policy. And that was a game very, very foreign to my nature. I was not a political person, and it just simply was extremely foreign to my nature. But funny enough, I realized it was an essential thing to do. So I combined it with setting up research. So I set up a research in 1998 with brain imaging in Zurich, to look at the changes in blood supply to the brain, and particularly trying to look at the changes in capillary volume, global capillary volume. And funny enough, the scientist I work with, my collaborator, rang me to say I'll be very, very pleased with the results. It showed an increase in global capillary volume, and particularly in the frontal cortex. And then for some unknown reason, again, because of the taboo, he never published the results, so I could never use them. So that, the funny thing about the game I call it, is how do you beat the taboo? Because the taboo is an amazingly, it's in kind of ancient culture, it's a dragon. It always comes up at unexpected moments. You think, I've made an advance, and then you suddenly realize, no, it's been negated.
Yes, I mean, we see that in everything, politics in particular, right? It's fear. It's the fear of, they've created this fear of change, fear of drugs, fear of anything. And it seems that people are more, can adapt easier to fear than they can adapt to positive change.
Exactly. And the funny thing is, years later, 30, 40 years later, after I got involved, I did a research with rats to see if you gave rats a rat dose of LSD, whether it would enhance their cognitive powers. And we found that when young rats love to explore new toys, when they become adult, they stop exploring new toys. They prefer the old ones they know, and they follow the old tracks and ignore the new toys. But if you give them 3 days before the experience, you give them a rat dose of LSD, then they'll go and explore the new toys. But interestingly, old rats, even when you gave them their LSD, they still didn't explore new toys. In order to encourage an old rat to explore, you need to give them the LSD plus enhanced conditioning. So that's how I think I'm actually now working on my passions at the moment. And amazingly, about quite a transformation, bring back the self after it's been lost. And that is very, very fascinating. And that's what I'm researching as one of the things I'm doing, which I think could make
a huge difference. I agree. I mean, I saw something, I don't know, a couple of years ago where they had octopi in a tank, and they put MMDA in the water. And as a whole rule, I mean, octopus tend to be very singular oriented. They don't hang out with other octopus. And when they went, right, so when they gave them this MMDA, it was game changing. They were all dancing together and hanging out in the water together, and it was just an incredible experiment.
I'd love to see that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's on the internet somewhere, but it really, for most people, for me, I was just like, of course, that's amazing, right? But I think for many people, the fear of losing control is what scares them.
Absolutely.
Instead, they drink, which is the worst.
Yes, that's an absolute terror. But what is so fascinating, and this is what we discovered through our brain imaging study with LSD, which was the first one ever to be done. I set up an organization called the Beckley Imperial Research Program with my old chum, Dave Nutt. And so finally, after whatever it was, 30 years, I managed to do a first brain imaging study with LSD. And that showed the immense enhancement of connectivity. The the repressive powers of the default mode network, which is, I'm sure you know, the kind of modern name for the ego, which keeps control, represses what it considers not essential, is diminished. The blood flow to that part of the brain is diminished, whereas the rest of the brain is flooded with more activity, putting up the connectivity to an amazing degree. And really, it's all about connectivity, because that's what underlies neuroplasticity, learning, change, all of the things we rather like, in fact, but are frightened of.
Yes, we are frightened of. I mean, drug reform is a matter of human rights, as far as I'm concerned, and we are being forced from a group of people in every single country that have deemed this as something that is bad and fearful and should be touched. But what is your perception of how drugs have changed in the past 40 years?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say the perception of them has really changed in the last kind of 5 years mainly.
You're probably, yes, you're absolutely right.
I mean, I was always convinced of their immense potential, and that it was a medicine that humanity really needed to take on, to not only heal, but to inspire, to transform, to overcome blockages, all sorts of amazing attributes it has. And now, which is rather satisfactory, we've to a certain degree discovered why it has this amazing effect. And now I'm just doing a very exciting research on the mystical experience using the very latest brain imaging technology, which is a 7 Tesla, which is the most expensive, most detailed fMRI. And we are going to do it as a personalized study. So each person, one will do different brain imaging, so you get a more exact picture of what's happening in the brain under the mystical experience. And but right back in the first brain imaging, what we saw was the change of the situation from the domination of the default mode network, which Freud described as the ego mechanism, into a more global sense of consciousness, where the whole brain is interrelated, and is more the mystical experience. It's a different experience, which can be frightening, because the loss of the ego can be experienced as frightening. It is frightening.
It is frightening, yes.
But hopefully, and that is where this kind of therapy comes in, when using it to heal psychological disorders, the therapy wants to give it a safe context in which
Yes.
the person can let go and experience the looser, more kind of chaotic state of consciousness, out of which a new understanding can grow, which is hopefully better suited to the individual for surviving happily.
Completely. I mean, we are seeing and hearing from so many therapists that are dealing with people with PTSD or depression, and they are very excited about drugs, anywhere from LSD to ketamine. There's just not enough therapists that are necessarily trained to walk a patient through that kind of change in their lives when they go this process.
Right, absolutely. And I mean, that's in a way the tragedy, because we actually did the first study at the Beckley Imperial program to find out that a kind of medium-high dose of psilocybin in the right setting with support, therapeutic support, does enable the person to reset their basic understanding of things. It's not just a kind of verbal understanding, it's a much deeper setting than the verbal. And people can really change their attitudes, change their feelings. And that can be very, very magical to them, having maybe suffered 18 years on average, the people that have studied depression for 18 years. And so suddenly to find themselves without depression is a wonderful experience. And then when the depression starts, if it does, to come back, which one, semi has to think might happen, they would contact us maybe and say, how can I have another experience to bring me
Exactly.
back into that wonderful state of not being depressed? And the answer is, it's impossible. It's not legal. There's nowhere in the world you can have it. So you either have to do it underground, which a lot of people
Oh, so many people are doing.
and it is a terrible thing, and we should do a fast track, which I'm hoping might happen in England, a fast track, so medication which has enough evidence that it is beneficial. Somehow one could start giving it to people who wanted it and not having to wait another 10 years for it to go through a high level regulation.
Is crazy, but yes, I do believe that will happen. I mean, certainly cannabis, which is something that should have been legal forever, used as well as this ridiculous, war on drugs. But as we have seen this going through every country of legalizing weed and getting to the point where sooner or later everyone is going to have legalized it, I sort of feel that this other that's coming up in the back end, which are more psilocybins, LSD, mushrooms, ketamine. You're not necessarily going to buy it at your local store, but the ability to use it in a medical setting would be game changing.
Yes, yes. I mean, funny enough, yesterday I was talking to the head of a major English institution with which I'm going to be doing an LSD study. And the amazing thing is that the transport, one, you can't get it. Two, when you can get it, the transport of it is tighter than transporting nuclear weapons. You have to have a double padlock each end, and guards, and I mean, you can't believe it. And there it is, it's freely available on the streets.
100%.
It's insane, basically.
It is insane.
Although all this science has been going on for the last, 20 years at least, if not much longer.
And people have been doing it thousands of years.
Yes, there's thousands of years of knowledge has built up to get us where we are, actually. They still haven't changed one single word of the UN conventions. I once got the leading world's expert to write how we would change the wording of the conventions in order to let individual countries decide what they do within their own control without interrupting other people's decisions, to enable the legal use of cannabis and psychedelics for medicine or even for later for personal use. I'm personally in favor of it being available.
I am too. Yes, depending on the dosage. Yes, I completely agree with you.
Not one word has been changed.
No. I mean, listen, there are still laws in our country that are so archaic where you'll see on the books of some state that a woman can't get their hair cut without their husband giving them the permission. I mean, and you're like, so how do you go back and change all these laws? But certainly I feel, and I'm sure you do too, that the changes that are going to happen are going to be amplified in the next couple of years. So they have to, because there's so much data, and particularly people that are coming back from some of these horrific wars, that it has been game changing for them to, reintegrate into society. that they couldn't do before. So I have one more question for you, and it's been such a delight to talk to you. Are you still doing LSD?
One can't answer that question without the threat of 25 years in prison. So, we must change the law first before
Yes.
we can have a truly open conversation.
Right. Fair enough. Very fair.
That's in England, 25 years.
Yes, yes, yes.
In Singapore, it's cutting
probably-
off your head.
I'm sure it is.
Execution.
Right.
So we're very lucky to be in England and only get 25 years.
Right. I don't know what it is in the United States, but there's probably like Tahiti, it probably doesn't make any difference.
Yeah. No, it's a tragedy, and it's a kind of, in a sense, an illustration of the insanity of the upright talking ape. We're a very, very clever little animal, but we've got so much wrong. And I do think, hopefully, the opening up of altered states, not that everyone will want it or should have it or anything, but the opening up of that area, I think, can add an element, an improved viewpoint from looser, more flexible, more adaptable viewpoint, which I think is valuable for our species.
I agree. Happier societies.
Yeah, for society.
Completely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being on. And when I come to London, I'm looking you up.
Please do.
All right, great. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.